I'm going to call to order the Committee on House Administration's hearing on examining our nation's voting process and the recommendations that were released by the Bauer-Ginsberg Commission in January of this year. And the hearing record will remain open for 5 legislative days so that members can submit any materials that they wish to be included therein. And a quorum is present, so we'll proceed. I certainly want to thank my fellow committee members for being here today to discuss this very important issue. And the purpose of this hearing is to discuss how states and local election officials can build upon the recommendations that were outlined in the Presidential Commission on Election Administration report, otherwise commonly known as the Bauer-Ginsberg Commission report. And I certainly want to thank the two co-chairs of the commission for coming today, and we appreciate your time and your attendance to this, and we appreciate your service as well to the 6-month study that you conducted to identify ways in which our state and local election officials can improve the voting process for every American. I was a former Secretary of State in Michigan, the chief elections official of my state, so I certainly understand the challenges. I like to think I understand the challenges of election officials and what they face each and every day. And it was my duty then, as it is for other secretaries of state, to ensure each and every election runs smoothly, that the voting process is absolutely accessible and understandable to citizens of voting age, and most importantly, that the results were accurate as possible when we go to elect our public leaders. It was certainly all of our hopes that the Commission's recommendations would assist the states in useful and effective and nonpartisan ways so that every election official is able to meet their mission of a successful election. And since the administration of elections is inherently a state function, I was very hesitant then, as I am now, about Washington mandates, which is why actually, in full transparency, I mentioned this to our two witnesses, when the President created the Bauer-Ginsberg Commission, I didn't believe that a new federal commission was needed. However, as I looked at your report, I have to say that I was very, I don't know if I should use the word pleasantly surprised, but I was very encouraged that the report focused on utilizing good local governance over elections, and it made recommendations on different ideas that I think really can help locals improve upon their own voting process. So we certainly didn't want to have the Commission's recommendations be shelfware. We thought it was great idea, and I talked to my ranking member about having this hearing in a way that we can hopefully amplify some of the recommendations that the Commission has made. It's certainly my belief that the primary role for federal government in election administration is not to dictate to local officials or to place mandates on them, but again, simply to help in an advisory way so that state election officials can do their important work to make certain that every American citizen is able to cast their vote and make sure that their votes are counted. I'll just give you one example from my time as Michigan Secretary of State. We actually in our state have a very decentralized type of election system administration, to the extent that we have over 1,800 various local units, various election clerks that are responsible for administering elections there. Every one of them previously to what we called the qualified voter file actually had maintained their own voter registration lists. It wasn't uncommon to go into some small areas and you'd find the clerks had put their voter registration lists in a cigar box in their closet or something. But at any rate, Michigan is quite a large state. And what we did is we computerized it all. We melded it all together. And we now call it the Michigan Qualified Voter File. We actually eliminated over 700,000 duplicate voter registrations from the file when we were able to do that. We had quite a bit of pushback initially from using that kind of technology. It doesn't seem so high tech today, but at the time it was, and it has worked really great. It's been a great product. In fact, it was cited by the Ford-Carter Presidential Commission on National Election Reform as a national model back in the day. And many other states have certainly used something like that and have improved upon it as well. I mention that just because we did that without any federal mandate. We did it without any federal money. The state of Michigan determined that this was something we wanted to invest in to make sure that our state's election officers were able to accomplish their goal. So we did it ourselves. And many of the recommendations offered by the Bauer-Ginsberg Commission, I think, were great suggestions and ideas that the states can implement. And again, they can do so without the need for federal financial assistance. This report offered a number of recommendations, best practices, practical suggestions, such as online tools to assist election officials with determining how many voting machines should be deployed in which area, depending on the need. Certainly, every state and local voting precinct tries to continually improve on their efforts to maintain up-to-date and accurate voter lists and resources and education materials on how and where to vote, and of course, ensuring that their ballot resources are properly deployed. They hope to accomplish these things while also, hopefully, reducing some of the administration costs that are associated with making all of this information available and streamlining the process. We are all aware of the challenges election officers face when it comes to administering elections, but particularly when their budgets are facing constraints that force them to prioritize. However, clearly the states want to have the best voting processes in place and one that fits best with their residents. The voting process is really not a one-size-fits-all, so even the best intended federal mandates, I think, can backfire when the process used historically in various states does not fit with that mandate. Every state should always strive to utilize good ideas and procedures that work for them, but they're wise to listen to good ideas from other states that can help them improve. Today we're here to listen to our two witnesses on their experience with this commission, what they learned from the various state and local election officials from around the country, and we're especially interested in hearing about what they have heard from election officials since the commission's report was released, especially, I think, as we're thinking about the upcoming midterm election where many of the voting precincts will be in the spotlight again. And I will also just take one moment of personal privilege and say that I was very pleased that the President also put on your commission an individual that, in my humble estimation, is the best election officer in the nation, Chris Thomas, who's the Michigan Director of State Elections. He's widely recognized as certainly really a leader in this field, and I know you had an excellent commission to work with. The right to vote is the foundation of the American democratic system, and the framers of our Constitution task each and every one of our states with the immense responsibility of administering and protecting that right. And while we, the federal government, always seek for better ways to be partners with the state, we need to keep in mind their challenges and to avoid costly mandates that could inhibit their ability to protect the integrity of our electoral system. And instead, we need to find ways to alleviate their burdens. Preserving the integrity of our electoral process is certainly of the utmost importance, and I know that, again, every state and every election officer takes that role seriously. Again, I want to thank you for coming, the two witnesses. We certainly are all looking forward to your testimony. We've read your opening statements, and at this time, I would like to recognize my ranking member, Mr. Brady from Pennsylvania, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First of all, can we put another log on the fire? It's awful hot in here, ain't it? Know anybody put the heat? This is not one of the meetings we need to be too hot at, you know. It's a good meeting. Yeah. Yeah, we thought we should be able to nice and cool in here. But anyway, I'd like to thank my friend, the Chairman Miller, for holding this hearing today. Having an open dialogue is vital to solving the problems that plague our elections. And I thank the Chair for calling attention to this issue of critical importance. I also want to thank our witnesses, Mr. Bauer and Mr. Ginsberg, whose demonstration and expertise, whose determination and expertise are critically important to fixing our elections. Following the 2012 presidential election, President Obama set out to improve America's voting experience. In 2012, many voters, regardless of their political affiliation, were faced with unreasonably long wait times to cast their ballot. Other eligible Americans were disenfranchised altogether as a result of outdated voter registration policies. Clean, efficient, and accurate elections are the cornerstone of our democratic system of government. It is crucial that we ensure that all eligible voters have full and unimpeded access to the ballot box. This is why I believe the work of the Commission was so important. I fully respect the autonomy of the states in administrating their elections, but also believe that Congress, and more specifically, this committee, has a duty to ensure no eligible voter is turned away for any reason. I will continue to advocate for equal access to the ballot box for all eligible voters. Once again, thank you, Madam Chairman, and I look forward to the testimony of our expert witnesses. And thank you for your participation, not only in this hearing, but in your participation, again, to making our election process work.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bauer, Mr. Ginsberg, for your work on this and for your service and for sharing the experiences and giving us much to consider. You know, the election process is very dear to me, not just because of I'm an elected official, but because it really embodies self-governance and how we do things in this country. So I began working on elections and political campaigns as a college student, like many individuals. Before I came to Congress, I served as county party chair for about 8 years. Was one of those souls down in West Palm Beach, Florida during the recount in 2000 as a Republican observer, and so it's quite a process to watch and participate in. But I think it's important to participate in the election process, and we wish everyone would. I know from firsthand experience in running numerous elections at the county level that it's not an easy task. Sometimes we don't anticipate as heavy a turnout as it winds up being, or misjudge where the turnout will be and misallocate voting machines. Machines break. Finding and training poll workers who in my home state work about 16-hour days for not a lot of money can be quite a challenge also. When everything runs smoothly, few people notice, but when a problem occurs, everybody screams and looks for the problems, whether they may claim fraud or corruption. I believe your commission primarily grew out of concerns about long lines and some difficulties with voting in the 2012 election, and what was really limited to a few jurisdictions. The assumption too many are quick to make is that some kind of voter suppression must have taken place. To me, long lines at voting precincts mean that a lot of people are voting, and that's always a very good thing. It's interesting how the media portrays people standing in long lines in other countries, whether it was in Iraq or Afghanistan or other countries, that those folks who wait in long lines are heroes, which they are. But long lines of Americans standing in line for a couple of hours is portrayed as a broken system. Now, this is not to say that we can't do better, and that we should, and that's why I think the focus of your report, we need to look at how we can make it easier for folks to vote. I'm all in favor of improving the process. I'm not in favor of weakening accountability. I have some concerns about early voting, and I worry about the integrity of electronic voting systems, both for voting and for recapping elections. There were allegations of a serious attempt of hacking of the electronic vote tabulation system during the recent Ukrainian presidential election by another foreign power in order to change the outcome. That's always disturbing. New technology is great, but we must have sufficient safeguards. And in my view, primitive as it may sound, there's no greater safeguard than a paper ballot. I appreciate the work you did on the commission and the report. And again, thank you for your appearances today. We look forward to your testimony. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Any other opening statements? Let me introduce our witnesses then. First, we have Robert Bauer, who is a partner at Perkins Coie. In his 30 years of practice, he has provided counseling and representation on matters involving regulation of political activity before the courts and administrative agencies of national party committees, candidates, political committees, individuals, federal office holders, corporations and trade associations, and tax-exempt groups. He served as a White House counsel to President Obama and returned to private practice in June 2011. In 2013, the President named Bob to be co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Elections Administration. He was general counsel to President Obama for America, or to Obama for America, and the President's campaign organization in 2008 and 2012, and he's general counsel to the Democratic National Committee. And our second witness, again the co-chair of the commission, is Benjamin Ginsberg, who is a partner at Jones Day in Washington, D.C., where he represents a variety of clients on election law issues, particularly those involving federal and state campaign finance laws, ethics and gift rules, pay-to-play laws, election administration, government investigations, communications law, and election recounts and contests. He recently served, as we say, as a co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. Prior to joining Jones Day in 2014, he served as national counsel to the Bush-Cheney presidential campaigns in the 2004 and 2000 election cycles and played a central role in the 2000 Florida recount. In 2012 and 2008, he served as national counsel to the Romney for President campaign, and he's also representing the campaigns and leadership PACs of numerous members of the Senate and House, as well as to the National Party committees. So we have talk about two experts in a very bipartisan way here before us today. I think this will certainly be an interesting testimony. And I would now recognize Mr. Bauer for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the committee, Ranking Member Brady. I'm very pleased to be here with my co-chair, Ben Ginsberg. We've become a bipartisan traveling party on this subject, and I'm glad to go first. I told your staff before we came, I'm always pleased to be Ben Ginsberg's warm-up act. I also would like to say one thing, Chair Miller, about Chris Thomas, because oddly I had penciled in his name to the written testimony to say that he is, in fact, one of the finest election administrators in the country and a member of our commission who, I think it is fair to say, and Ben will agree with me, performed outstandingly and is an important part of the implementation of the recommendations of the report that in the division of testimony that Ben and I have agreed upon, Ben will talk about. But let me just say very briefly, and I've submitted a statement for the record so I won't duplicate it, let me say a little bit something briefly about the approach that we took and also some of our experience with the positive reception of the report and how that's shaping how we look at what lies ahead, including the effort to implement this report. Our outstanding research director, Nate Persley of Stanford Law, was fond of saying throughout our experience with the commission that we were working not so much on a report as on a project, on a long-term project. And we view the report, in effect, as having kicked something off with its publication, not ending the day it was published, but in effect opening up with its publication opportunities to work on these recommendations that are very, very important to us and how we perceive the success of what we have done. Now, of course, the origin of the Commission's work is fairly traced to the problem of long lines. That obviously received a lot of attention when the Commission was established. But the Commission, of course, was charged with looking at a range of issues that election administrators face. And of great importance to us, and I want to stress it here today, is that it is important that we view election administration as a subject of public administration. Obviously, politics enters into this discussion all the time, but at bottom and throughout our work, we tried to focus on election administration as a topic of public administration and to look at the service that we provided our voters as very similar to the service that our best companies would provide their customers. We have to treat the voters with the same respect and hope to achieve on their behalf the same level of performance and efficiency. When we think about the problems that we encounter in the voting process, we know that any one problem we identify could have many sources. So if we think about lines, for example, there may be any number of reasons why lines prove to be impermissibly or inappropriately long. That could include the design and administration of polling places, errors in voter registration lists, poor training programs for polling workers. There are a variety of reasons, so the problem has to be attacked at various different points. Throughout our consideration of the issues, we looked very hard at data. Of great importance to bipartisan election administration is to stay close to the facts, to the data, to the best understanding of how elections are administered and what goes wrong with elections. And that's why we were well served by the senior research director we have, both a political scientist and a law professor, Professor Persley, who helped guide the commission to the best sources of information that we have about what really takes place in the conduct of elections and what really lies behind some of the problems that our voters confront. So with those few preliminary observations, let me just add a couple more. We heard at the outset of our work from a variety of sources, from election administrators around the country, that they were concerned that one size of reform did not fit all. And we understand that there's a concern with one size does not fit all, that it's possible that what works in one jurisdiction may not work in another. But we're confident, and I think this is true of all of the commissioners, that our recommendations are suitable for the vast majority of jurisdictions. All election administrators, as the chair well knows, as a former Secretary of State, confront a similar set of challenges, from the registration of voters and the verification of eligibility, through polling place management and equipment acquisition, to the successful transmission and tally of the results. And we found that our administrators across the country, whom we heard from in hearings, informal hearings, and also in the course of testimony that we elicited, all agreed that there were fundamental responsibilities that election administrators engaged in that could be addressed with solutions of common application. Those administrators we want to stress, I certainly want to stress, I think Ben would agree, deserve all the support that they can get. They're asked to perform at the highest levels, but routinely provided with inadequate levels of support, and in particular, inadequate levels of resources. Our elections occur periodically in this country, but the issues of election administration receive generally only infrequent attention. And the Commission, while not making any specific recommendations about the level of resources required, did want to and did stress that at the end of the day, states and localities do need resources to carry out the functions that they are engaged in. And this question of resources is deeply implicated in a second point that I wanted to raise out of the report before this committee, and that is the resources that will be required, the thinking and the planning that will be required to meet the challenge that we face in the next generation of voting technology. The Commission has described this as a looming technology crisis. It didn't mean to exaggerate, and I don't think it did exaggerate. Election administrators across the country, everywhere, Democratic and Republican, express concern that we are facing a major problem with transitioning from the technology currently in use to the technology that we will need in elections still to come. And we have to listen carefully to them. They're the ones who are putting on elections. They're the ones who are ordering the machines, testing the machines, using the machines, and that's what they are telling us. This importance of resources is matched by the very important question of how election administrators allocate the resources that they have. And here we tried to supplement the report that we issued with the provision of online tools that would assist administrators in the management of the polling place to avoid and anticipate long lines. The tools that the Commission recommended are still posted online and available on the Caltech MIT Technology Project website. They're open source, they're available for improvement, and as Ben will describe shortly, we are going to continue to work with election administrators to make these tools widely available, to work with them, to improve them, and to try in other ways to be supportive of their efforts to address the lines problem. And finally, one quick point, because I see that my time has expired. The Commission's focus was on state and local election administration and the means of improving it through administrative reform and best practices. We didn't make federal legislative recommendations, but we did hear testimony across the board from jurisdictions that there are federal statutes that protect discrete populations of voters, military voters, language minority voters, disabled voters, that simply are not attracting the level of compliance and the success of compliance that they should. One notable exception is the MOVE Act that affects military voters, which seems to have been quite successful by all accounts, but other statutes that we have confronted, the ones that I've cited, have not been similarly as successful as they might be in implementation. And in particular, and here I'm channeling Chris Thomas, because nobody expresses this better in a more informed way or frankly more tartly than Chris Thomas, we have a major problem with departments of motor vehicles across the country who are not attending successfully to their registration responsibilities under the National Voter Registration Act. And this is something that we hope will receive attention across the country. So the federal government has established an important presence in these areas, and compliance is critically important. So with that, I would like to close by saying we are pleased with the reception of the recommendations. We hear continued offers to continue to work on those recommendations from state and local election officials, and where we go from here, this phase of implementation is something I would like to turn over to my co-chair, Mr. Ginsberg, to discuss further. And I would say before I do so, I'm not surprised, but it was an absolute pleasure to work with Ben Ginsberg on this, and I would never say so privately, so I thought I would say so publicly.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that, Mr. Bauer, and Chair recognizes Mr. Ginsberg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ranking Member Brady, thank you for having us here today. We very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Commission and its recommendations and how we plan on implementing its best practices and advice we have for state and local jurisdictions. It was a pleasure to work with Bob. We did enjoy the opportunity to step out for a bit, yet bring our perspectives from being in the partisan trenches for many years. The members of our commission, Chris Thomas and his 7 colleagues, provided a great deal of expertise to us. Nate Persley was remarkable in the breadth of research. We held hearings around the country and numerous meetings with interest groups and individuals concerned about the process, and that helped inform the recommendations and best practices that we presented in the report. Two general points. First, Bob and I are both very proud of what is in the report, the way that we have tried to deal with the situations that state and local officials who put on elections and attempt to ease the problems which serve as obstacles to duly qualified citizens being able to cast their votes. That was our mission and what we've tried to do in the report. We'd urge you to read the report, and this summary of our testimony will touch on some of the highlights. There are no federal mandates. In the report, we believe the Commission came up with practical solutions for state and local administrators to make the voting experience better for all citizens. The report passed with bipartisan and unanimous agreement. Secondly, we were certainly acutely aware that the actual implementation of this or any report is the really hard part, especially in an area like election administration that is so decentralized in our country. Thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center here in Washington, there is an ongoing plan to implement the Commission's recommendations and best practices, which I look forward to describing in a moment. The area into which this report delves, elections and voting, is certainly one where there can be conflict between Republicans and Democrats. But it's also a subject where Republicans and Democrats can agree and do agree on the basic principle that every legally registered voter has the right to be able to cast his or her ballot easily and without barriers. For that reason, there is a positive agenda of reforms that can be made in this area, and we believe that the report provides that blueprint. For the solutions, the Commission recognized at the outset that our elections are administered by approximately 8,000 different jurisdictions, largely using volunteers who often don't receive proper training. As a result, achieving uniformity or federal solutions that actually work in our elections has proven challenging. There are individual specifics included in the written testimony and, of course, in the report itself. But in terms of a positive agenda moving forward, I particularly urge you to look at long lines, a problem that should not exist, for which we provide practical solutions and recommendations. We found after our study that, in fact, the solutions, as Bob mentioned, are identifiable and solvable, and the report and the websites provide tools to be able to do that, as well as the practical, on-the-ground best practices that others who have faced this situation have recommended. Online registration and two programs that help the states check the accuracy of their voter registration lists against those of other states each receives support across the political spectrum. Accurate voter lists is something that the right and the left agree is necessary, whether for the purpose of providing greater efficiency, more accuracy, cost savings. Online registration and the two programs are helpful ingredients to a positive agenda. Reducing the barriers to voting that Bob mentioned, faced by military, overseas voters, disabled voters, language minorities, is all an important part of enforcing laws that are on the books and doing the right thing for our citizens. And again, the practical recommendations and best practices are included. The simple proposition is that, as Bob said, we do have two major things to deal with. One is the technology crisis. We did not meet a single state or local administrator who either was satisfied with the machines that their jurisdiction was using at the moment or saw a solution in what was currently available on the market, or was pleased with the certification process that makes it much more difficult to be able to move forward with technological advances that have taken place in the rest of society. And the adequate physical facilities that communities rely on is often schools, yet there are problems with using schools because of safety concerns. That's a conflict. The rights of voters and the safety of children that should not be allowed to conflict. The report recommends having in-service training days on election days so that schools can be used, but that's something that state and local administrators that we wish to try and enable them to achieve. In terms of the implementation, as I mentioned at the outset, it's really important to get the recommendations and best practices into state and local jurisdictions and being able to use on that level. We're particularly thankful for that reason to the Bipartisan Policy Center, which has agreed to house a program whose goal is to get the recommendations and best practices implemented by the states and localities. Specifically, the center has augmented its staff by bringing on 2 people very involved with voting issues, one an alum of our commission, the other a former state election official. They'll be working directly with states and localities, looking for opportunities to implement legislation, looking for opportunities to go into some of the polling places with historically long lines to be able to implement the solutions to help that serve as a test case for others. The BPC project will also work on improving the certification process for new technology and look for legislative opportunities on online registration, legislation to ensure the place of schools as voting places, and other improvements that are mentioned in the report. With that, let me reiterate that there is a positive agenda with which Republicans and Democrats can move forward so that all legally qualified voters can cast their ballots without barriers that all agree should not be there. Thanks again for having us here today and letting us report to you on our recommendations, best practices, and how we'll implement them.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Let me just start with a question, and I think it was really sort of the impetus for the president putting the commission in place, really, was the long lines that we all watched. And I have to tell you, and I don't mean to always talk about my experience as Secretary of State, but we all come from our own prism of whatever our personal experiences were. And we're looking at sort of the usual suspects of where these long lines were, because it wasn't all over the country. It wasn't in some of the precincts that had heavy voter participation. You know, in a state like mine that doesn't have either early vote or same-day registration or any of those kinds of things, it doesn't even have no reason AV voting. I'm not going to say we had no lines anywhere, but there was no reports of anybody. I mean, what we saw on the TV that was happening in one state was really happening in one state, from what I could tell. There were a couple of other areas. And, you know, I'm sure, I mean, I talked to some of our other election officials afterward and said, you know, you can just see what happened there. They didn't have enough voting equipment. I mean, it's pretty fundamental things, I think. It's my personal opinion. They didn't have enough voting equipment. They hadn't had good education or training for the precinct, the voting election workers that they had, as you say. Many of them, most of them are volunteers, or else they just hire them as they need. That's not their full-time job. They perhaps didn't take into account the number of registered voters in that particular precinct and had them, you know, put in the proper numeric order, and all of these kinds of things. Again, I think it's sort of a fundamental thing. So actually, in the case of Florida, not to point on Florida, but I thought that the governor of Florida did exactly the right thing, actually, by tasking his Secretary of State, their Secretary of State, with taking a look at what had happened there and making some recommendations, which they did. And I looked at that report, and it was very much along the lines of what I'm talking about here, the kinds of problems that they found. But is there anything in particular that you think, as you've looked at that? I mean, again, talking about federal mandates, you can't mandate good management, obviously. But what kinds of things we could help amplify the Commission's recommendations so that election workers that do experience these kinds of long lines, what can we actually do? Obviously, nobody wants to look at these very long lines. There was one individual in particular that I know the President pointed to as an elderly person who had to wait for a long time. She was trying to early vote, And, I was just thinking, why didn't they vote absentee? Or perhaps they could have some line workers come out and, for goodness sakes, offer her a chair or something. I mean, some of these basic kinds of things. Again, it's not really a federal mandate. It's just, so I'm not quite sure where what we can do to assist in that area, other than pointing out these very basic things. And what is your, to either of our witnesses in regards to the long line? Is there anything that was unbelievably unique that caused these long lines, other than what most election officers would recognize immediately?
It seemed to vary very much by the jurisdictions where there were problems, with some commonalities. But again, when you have 8,000 different jurisdictions administering elections, uniformity is not one of those things that's going to come naturally. In the places where there did seem to be long lines, and we held a field hearing in Miami and heard from the administrators of most of the counties that had the line problem, part of it is administrative decision-making. Part of it is the facilities in which polling places actually take place. And part of it is just kind of what you mentioned, which is recognizing which particular precincts are going to have a greater influx of voters because of new registrations. Even in the counties around the country where there were the worst lines, it was not at every polling place. It was only at some of the polling places, and actually a relatively few number of the polling places where there were long lines. It's a problem that should be dealt with. The resource tools that are at supportthevoter.gov and on the Caltech MIT website that Bob mentioned provide a way that not only election administrators, but actually citizens who want to deal with the number of machines available, the historic voter flows, both in terms of raw numbers and when they occur during the day, can all provide that. The report also goes into common sense solutions, like providing sample ballots to people beforehand so they can read the ballot before they go into the polling place and help with their decisions. Line walkers who go around and spot problems while they're waiting in line before they're people who are actually going through the process and slowing everybody else down. Providing big central rooms where people can wait to vote. You go in, you take a number, and then you sit in a comfortable place so you don't have to stand online outside. If the facilities like schools can accomplish that, are all part of the practical solutions that can occur.
Mr. Bauer?
I agree with what Ben has said. You asked also as part of the question is, so who's helping them, and what are the relative roles, federal government, the states themselves, as in the initiative that you described to the Florida governor. And what I think this presidential commission attempted to do was to draw together the best learning, and in some cases to encourage new learning about administrative problems that lead to long lines as one of the problems that we looked at, and to give in a very uniform, very focused way, to give election administrators a way to think about the problem and the possible solutions. So, for example, we unanimously found that election administrators should have 30 minutes in mind as the wait time for voters. 30 minutes should be effectively the maximum. Not that that is a goal that could always be achieved, because there'll be circumstances in which, for reasons beyond the administrator's control, the line wait will be longer than 30 minutes. But in those cases, there ought to be contingency plans that the administrators can put into effect if they know that there's going to be a 30-plus minute wait. And Ben is correct that the problem is a problem that's found in pockets around the country, but we found that the total number of voters affected in one way or the other by lines longer than 30 minutes or lines longer than an hour is 10 million voters, and that's a significant number of voters and arguably could expand. And so what we attempted to do was, as a presidential commission, to take the best learning, encourage some new learning, and then through the implementation to push out, in complete cooperation with state and local election officials, as much of the best understanding of administrative practice as we possibly could, drawing on what the Election Assistance Commission has done over the years in counseling on issues like, for example, polling management and poll worker training, drawing in organizations like the one that Chris Thomas chairs, the National Association of Election Directors. And that's an important function, this function of providing a clearinghouse and an organizing center for the best possible learning about what to do to solve these problems. And we find in the implementation phase, and I think Ben has described it, a very positive reception to an ongoing effort like this that brings together the best that both the federal and the state and local initiatives can offer.
Thank you. And I absolutely agree that the National Association of Secretaries of State, that both myself and Mr. Rikita were former members of, I think he was a president one year, and also the National Association of Election Officers, et cetera, do all of this ongoing education and things that they're discussing and helping the locals with is there's no second almost for that kind of a thing. I did want to also ask a question about the resources needed. You both mentioned about the resources needed. I know I sound like a broken record back when I was a Secretary of State, but back when I was a Secretary of State, before I came to Congress, right at that time, HAVA had been passed by the Congress, so I wasn't here when it was passed. But all of a sudden, we had this huge windfall of dollars that was coming, recognizing that the federal government was about to send $4 billion out to the elections officials around the nation to upgrade principally to upgrade their voting equipment. And this had never been done before. I think it was, if we would have known the word TARP at the time, we would have said that was HAVA was like TARP for election officials. It was amazing that all of this money was coming. And I think the Congress, trying not to mandate, really didn't have much strings attached to it as far as the kind of election equipment that should be purchased or what have you. I mean, I remember, again, in Michigan, my successor actually implemented it all, but we put in place, we have over 5,000 precincts in our state, and said you could only purchase either optical scan or Optitect at that time. And we were going to have uniformity of the kind of equipment that we were going to have out there. Well, you saw a lot of these states that were buying everything under the sun. I mean, there was no uniformity. And, of course, some of this election equipment is very interesting. And at that time, with all the technology and everything, it had all the bells and the whistles. You thought you wanted to have all these great computers. But, as you know, computers do break. And so no surprise that there was problems with election equipment that was purchased by federal dollars. But now, all of these years later, the equipment's where it's had its normal life expectancy, and I cannot imagine with the federal restrictions that we have on our budget now that there will be another type of billions of dollars of sending. I mean, if it is for the state and the locals to run elections, how can the federal government be looked at as the ones that just gives them all the money for this? So it is, I think, incumbent on the locals as well to do some planning with investing in elections to make sure that they do have the money to purchase what is very expensive equipment and all of these kinds of things. What was your thinking as the commission talked to? Did you have the feeling that there's an expectation out there in the country that the federal government will forevermore provide funds for election equipment, or how is this looked upon?
Ben was glad to have me answer that one first. What we did discover was election administrators certainly mourn the passing of HAVA funding, that there was money available for this and now it's very hard to come by. So there's no question that they are in a different position right now, which they find very, very difficult. And we did not attempt to say where the resources would be located. One of our charges was, as I mentioned in my opening statement, we were not to make federal legislative recommendations. We didn't delve into the question of where the resources might be found. But without any question whatsoever, they have to be found somewhere because, as you know, as a former Secretary of State, I mean, these equipments are expensive. The equipment is expensive. There has to be money for repair and maintenance, but the acquisition costs alone are going to be very, very significant. And the entire process of identifying the best next generation of equipment entails costs. And so these administrators are, in the first instance, and we heard a good bit of this, troubled that they're having difficulty communicating with their state and local elected officials on this topic. They find that they are last in line in every budgetary conversation, that these are priorities that are, by and large, shuffled to the bottom of the deck because, understandably, faced with very difficult choices, elected officials have other priorities to attend to, education and road repair and the like. And elections being periodic tend to be treated as something that could be dealt with later or, frankly, made to do without, made to do with less. And this, in the case of technology development here in acquisition, is unsustainable over the long run. So I can't say that their expectation is that the federal government will do it or that the state government will do it or a combination of both, but their question is, where is it going to come from? Because without it, we're facing a real disaster.
I would say that there is a wish but not an expectation amongst the state and local officials that the money come from the federal government, but I don't think they expect that. And historically, with the exception of the HAVA influx, it has been a state and local responsibility. I would say that the bright spot out there is that technology, if it ever gets to catch up through the certification process, can help reduce the cost of systems. I mean, you now have these big, huge standalone systems that can only be used for elections. The move to electronic poll books to help out is one. There are software voting programs out there, not a paper ballot for purposes of historic integrity, but it seems to be where you're going. That can be a much less expensive alternative for states. The problem is we've kind of tied ourselves into a knot on this whole process, that the last time there were a new set of certification standards was 2007, which was before there was such a thing as a tablet computer anywhere. And so the technology available has not caught up to voting systems yet. That's one way that things can help out. We've got to do something about the certification process so that new and improved technology can be integrated into the system before all machines start running out.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes my ranking member, Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The only thing I think is worse than long lines is no lines. It's like a double-edged sword. We worry about increasing voter participation, making it easier, and then we have long lines that cause people a problem when it's time for them to vote. I've been doing elections too many years in the city of Philadelphia, which is a blood sport, by the way, and I've been fighting with Secretary of States forever, and trying to, I understand that we can't have uniformity throughout the United States because states have their rights, but trying to get our state uniformity with the amount of people that are on a ballot. And then they end up throwing ballot questions with all whereas clauses, and people want to sit and read them. If we can get uniformity within the state, I think it would be easier on certain, we have elections twice a year. There's no real need to have a ballot question or some other maybe offices that are way down offices that are, that are important, especially important for the people that are running in them. But if we could have some uniformity throughout the state, that we don't have a long ballot on one primary, and then in the general we have a short ballot. And just this past primary, we had a major governor's election with a contentious primary. We had 70% of the people come out and vote, which is disgraceful. It's embarrassing, for a major election for a governor. And it seems to me that if we can make it easier for people to vote, that would eliminate lines and make it easier for them to cast their vote, and that it maybe would help them to want to come out and vote because it's easier for them to do that. I understand that and looked at all the internet ideas, and I agree with Mr. Harper. Maybe early voting isn't always the answer because there's always a fraud factor. Eyeball participation, identification, fingerprint, phone voting. It's a tough job that you have, and I can't think of two more qualified people that can hopefully come back to us. And I do read your report, and I will also ask unanimous consent to insert the entirety of the Commissioner's report into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And I do read your report, and it is a in-depth and a good report, but I guess how do you implement it? How do we try to get people to buy in There are people that like long lines and people that don't. But what they don't understand is that we're still infringing on people's rights, making them have the ability, making it easier for them to vote, and by making it easier for them to vote, we can increase the voter participation for whoever they're voting for. So I guess, I just support what you do. I don't have a crystal ball, nor do any of us have a crystal ball to know what we could possibly do. There are things out there. There are things that we can implement, hopefully, to make it happen. I don't ever have a problem with long lines. We seem to be okay with long lines. It's inconvenient, but when we have long lines, we have participation, so that doesn't really cause me a problem as much as no lines. That's what my problem. So I commend and appreciate what you do. I also like for an answer sent to insert in the entirety, and to insert a letter from the Federation of American Women's Clubs overseas into the record.
Without objection.
I appreciate it, Madam Chairman, and I guess I don't have any questions because I'm really looking for answers, and I think you've done the best that you could do, but we need and I'd like to also real quickly piggyback on what our chairman said. Is there anything that we could do, or is there something we could do as our committee and as our positions here to whatever resources you may need, whether it be intelligence, whether it be funding, whatever we could do to try to make both of these long lines shorter and make these no lines more participant of. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank each of you for your comments. And I think we're all in agreement that everybody who wants to vote, who's legally entitled to vote, should be able to vote. And those long lines create a sense of excitement on Election Day, and it's something that's very special. And having dealt with elections, certainly on a county level, every election, no matter how well you plan, how well you train, there's going to be some confusion, and it may be as simple as the problem of having a split precinct where you sometimes despite your best training, they don't know which ballot to take. So we see those issues that go on from time to time too. And early voting, what we see is, yes, you can say it may ease the long lines, but I've had many people in states where they have early voting that say, things happen during the last week or two of an election that may change a mind or new information, and so you lose that to go up to the Election Day, which sometimes is a concern for me. And certainly I spoke in my opening statement about how important it is to have integrity and accountability of elections. Election Day is a special day. It's something that I think as Americans we like that excitement, and I certainly understand the purpose of early voting, and certainly increasing voter participation is an argument in favor, but it does concern me that early voting can take away from Election Day itself. So if one accepts that election campaigns serve a valid role, both to influence and educate voters over a relatively short period of time, then early voting can shorten or even subsume rather than enhance that role. Could each of you comment on that? And I'll start with you, Mr. Ginsberg.
Sure. Early voting is interesting to look at from a nationwide perspective because there are regions of the country that engage in early voting a lot more than other regions. New England, for example, does not believe in it, much for the reasons that you state about the sense of community. And there are different types of early voting. Absentee balloting is early voting. That actually is where there are more instances of fraud. In-person early voting is still eyeball-to-eyeball contact, so not as objectionable from the fraud and security angle. I think overall there is now no excuse absentee voting in 27 states around the country, pretty evenly split between Republicans and Democrats in positions of authority as election officials in the states, and early in-person absentee balloting in 32 states, again, pretty evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. To us, that reflected something that the voters wanted and asked for in those different states, and the state and local officials, without a federal mandate of any sort, implemented it in their states. So I think that I share your personal concerns about Election Day being a special day, but I've also seen from this that both Republican and Democratic state and local officials alike have decided that early voting is something that their citizens are demanding, and they've implemented it.
Okay. Mr. Bauer.
I agree with Ben that what we're dealing with here is voter expectation. Voters want voting to begin to mesh with the way they live their lives generally. They live their lives a certain way, and our voting system in many respects lags behind their expectation in the efficiency with which it's delivered and the ease of access that it offers. And so I think that election officials around the country, Democratic or Republican, are under tremendous pressure to offer multiple forms of voting before Election Day. So I think that the way we looked at it is essentially that voting is special. That's a special act. But it cannot be, in light of voter expectation, crammed into a single day Tuesday any longer. That's not what voters expect, and that's not the message they're sending to their elected officials.
I want to thank each of you for many, many hours you've spent on this, and we have, I think, some common goals that we can work towards. And so thank you for all of your hard work, and with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and before I recognize the gentleman from Florida for his questions, I just have to, you're talking about early vote. I know the entire nation is always looking at New Hampshire, whose motto is live free or die, to Dixville Notch. Remember, every presidential, they go to Dixville Notch, where there are 8 registered voters. They don't have early vote, but it is an interesting thing. We all wait to see what Dixville Notch is going to do there with their voting. But at this time, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I certainly hope that Florida is not in the limelight again in regards to voting issues. We tend to have been that way over the last few election cycles, but I think that the governor recognized the fact that some policies that were put in place weren't working, and that he tasked the Secretary of State to come up with a report, which he did in February of 2013, much to the same conclusions that you all have come up with. And I mean, Florida does, early voting, absentee voting, early absentee voting. I mean, in-face absentee voting, I guess it is. And the number of voters turning out, though, still seems to lag behind where it should be. Even though we've put in place, like on early voting, part of the problem was that they had to have it at either, it had to be a supervisor of elections office or substation type office, annex office, and they've expanded that now to a number of community buildings that early voting can take place. But how do you get people to come out to vote? And I think that's the question that, Mr. Brady was asking. I'd rather have people in lines voting than nobody voting, or, underutilizing the precincts that are put up. How do you actually, we talk about convenience of voting. I think we've made it really convenient. It'll be interesting to see what happens in this election with the changes that were made in 2013, but I'm not optimistic that it's going to increase the number of voters coming out to vote. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts on that as you went through this process? Did anything come forward? I've heard about convenience, but I don't know how else to make it more convenient.
I suppose it's fair to say that all of the commissioners have asked would have heard and would believe that there are a variety of factors that bear on turnout, and that the one thing we could do is to address one factor we hope wouldn't bear on turnout, and that is that there would be maladministration of the electoral process, and that frustration with access would be one of those factors. We wouldn't say for a moment that if if you remove all of those barriers, that we would predict that somehow turnout would rise up to the levels that you would like to see and that we would like to see. There are other factors that certainly are going to bear on turnout, and so removing those administrative obstacles would not be sufficient themselves. But it is one thing you wouldn't want to hear from voters, that they had wanted to vote and somehow they couldn't. They couldn't because their name was not on the rolls, or they couldn't because they were in line for 3.5 hours and their child care was no longer available, so they had to peel off from the line and couldn't vote any longer. Those things you wouldn't want to hear. And so just in that one sense, that's what we were focused on, but certainly it is true that there are a variety of reasons why we have different turnout levels in different types of elections. It varies by state, and it's a complex question to which we can only make the limited contribution we hope to make with the recommendations in this report.
And one of the things that I worry about as you move more into technology in regards to voting is the ability to compromise that. We see this, across the board, whether it's Target or whatever. There are ways to access information and what you worry about is that is massive fraud that could be perpetrated. So I want to make sure that as we move forward and the technology end of it, that we actually have the fraud protection in place, because we use these things all the time for a lot of things that we think we're safe on, whether it's transactions with banks, whatever else. We tend to trust that, we're safely doing it, and what we're hearing is that that's not necessarily the case. And so I worry that as we move forward in the technology end of it as it relates to elections, that we really have the ability to protect those results and those voter rolls from fraud.
The commission certainly came to agree with you on that. I would say that among the more robust debates we heard was the technology security debate, and for purposes of the report, we came out in favor of online registration and the use of electronic poll books in the polling places, just because it's much more efficient and just as accurate as mounds and mounds of paper to check people in a much quicker way. But we certainly did not express an opinion on voting online, because the balance of the debate was that we're just not ready for that yet.
Yeah, cybersecurity would obviously be an issue. We're being attacked by hackers from all over the world. Can you imagine some of the state actors that would love to influence an election, particularly a national election, would be very tempting to them, I would think. So I appreciate it. And Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the former Secretary of State from Indiana, Mr. Rokita.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate that recognition, and thank you to the to you both you gentlemen for your leadership. It's greatly appreciated. I have been saying for years that the problems associated with Florida's elections really had nothing to do with secretaries of state or local election officials, but really it was the sheriffs of the state that were the problem.
The gentleman would yield on that.
Very briefly. I associate with the gentleman. I mean, as Secretary of State, I often had this question. You're almost to the point, when I'm being facetious, of course, here and embellishing, but you can roll out of bed and vote, and yet voter turnout doesn't go up. And it's because we have a cultural issue. People don't value, perhaps, the experience, and we have to ask ourselves why. And it seemed like that might have been beyond the technical nature of your commission. In fact, and I know you shied away from photo ID, and I don't want to get into that debate here, but I often use that as an example of how it would, and in Indiana, it actually increased voter turnout when we went to that, because people saw that the administrators valued the process enough to say, hey, we're going to ask the same kind of questions we ask when you go to a video store, which we used to do at the time, or when we get on a plane and do those same things. And when I think constituents and voters and the public see that we place those kind of, that high level of interest and value in the process, you'll see more turnout. But speaking of value, in the technology section, I didn't see, and maybe it was somewhere else, I did not see that you mentioned voting centers as a solution to this. Was that talked about, and did you Ben? You're nodding your head.
We did talk about it.
Yeah.
We talked about them favorably. They seem to be an innovation that is working in a number of states, particularly states that have adopted early voting, have gone to
Right, because
voting
there's no wrong place to vote. So if there's a big line on one side of town for one reason or the other, you can immediately start, through the social media and everything else and through apps, redirect people. And you got to use technology the right way to make sure it's secure, and make sure your poll workers can fairly critique and properly challenge a voter. But the idea that we can use technology now, so there's really no wrong place to go, I think is very valuable. Secondly, Mr. Bauer, thank you for your work again. You use the example of it, or the max shouldn't be more than 30 minutes to wait in line. And then you said unless there are some things outside of our control. What are examples of what's outside our control?
An example, and we heard this from election administrators, is that the polls open and there are already 700 people waiting to vote. They've been there for an hour or so waiting for the polls to open. They wanted to vote early. Or in the early afternoon, there's a get out the vote surge on one side or the other, and 7 buses pull out and voters start coming out to vote. And so that will be a challenge for administrators, that over that period of time there's likely to be a buildup of voters.
Unless you had vote centers.
Pardon me?
Which is in our control.
If you have, there are a variety of ways of addressing that, including vote centers. But in a case where they realize that they're looking at longer lines, there are steps that they can take. They need contingency plans so that the problem doesn't mushroom. And our only point by setting up the 30 minutes was to establish a framework for them to think about how our voters experience the voting. Mr. Nugent points out we have problems with turnout. We don't want voters to walk away thinking that either the system isn't functioning properly, or it's not functioning properly because no one's paying attention to their own interests and their own requirements for voting. And so as long as the voters perceive, and there's evidence to suggest this, that the administrators are responding to the problem. They may not be able to deliver a 7-minute wait time, but they're clearly responding to the problem. That is reassuring to the voter, will enhance voter contact,
Right.
confidence. And
Like
it
at
will,
a grocery store when you open up a new line or something like that.
Pardon me?
Like at a grocery store when you open up a new line. When
Absolutely
you see
correct.
Same kind of, that goes
Correct.
to your point about how we live our lives today and what we can do to adapt.
Precisely.
I completely agree with that. My question turned more on, what's really outside our control and what's really inside our control, I guess is what I was trying to get from you. Do you have any other examples? What's an act of God that we should, reasonably expect could cause a delay?
Well, I'm not sure I'd refer to a power outage as an act of God, but I could imagine flooding.
Act of the EPA.
Weather, right? Weather, well, a separate hearing, no doubt. I would imagine something, a weather event with flooding, a power outage. One of the things that we addressed in our report, for example, is that there are, in fact, real weaknesses in contingency planning for natural disasters. Now, that's been taken up, by the way, by a task force of the National Association of Secretaries of State. It's been looking at that. But we need election administrators to have a playbook that they can turn to when administrative problems beset the polling place.
Understood. Thank you. And, Madam Chair, I know my time's expired, but I noticed that the red light's been on for others. So just let me finish with one more question now. In Florida, wasn't it true that, and apologize if you testified to this already, in Florida in 2012 in the general election, weren't there 11 or so constitutional amendments on the ballot?
There were.
Yes or yeah, yes, right?
There were.
And everyone reading those, like the ranking member says. I mean,
Well, I'm not sure everyone was, but certainly some people were. It does make sense for states, and we heard this from numerous state and local officials, to recognize that the heaviest turnout is going to occur in presidential years. And therefore, if you're going to put constitutional amendments on a ballot, the general election in a presidential year is probably not the right time to do it.
or get ready to spend a lot more on an election so that you can properly size the process for the,
Well, the other recommendation that we have.
or stop being a
provision-
referendum state.
Yeah, we're
Not
providing.
that, these are constitutional amendments, but other states might have the same kind of problem if they're a referenda state, right?
Providing sample ballots so that people can read all those before they go into the polling place and
Well,
not
now-
take up the line is another way to deal with the situation where you do have a lot of constitutional amendments on the ballot. So you don't have to read it for the first time while you're waiting.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Florida, and my time's expired.
Thank you. Well, I can talk firsthand in regards to the constitutional amendments that were on the ballot. They did all the things that you talked about. The Supervised Elections Office sent out, ballots early, sample ballots, all the constitutional amendments that was in the press. But it is so overwhelming, and I think the state of Florida has recognized that, and they changed the law in regards to limiting the amount of information on a constitutional amendment to 75 words, I believe, but also limiting the number of initiatives that can be on a ballot, because that was just overwhelming in regards to voters. Because even if you have all that pre-information, you still get there and you pull it out and you go,
Yeah.
oh, hold on a second, I want to read this one more time before I cast my vote. And a lot of folks were doing that because, I saw it when I went to vote. It was gumming up the works, let's say. And I think states need to be cognizant of that. I think Florida has finally figured that one out. Like I said, I hope Florida is not the poster child of election issues in the future. But as it is still a rapidly growing state, we do have our growing pains. So I want to yield back and thank the gentleman from Indiana.
Thank you. I'm going to recognize myself for a second round of questions here. And, just one thing that Mr. Rokita was mentioning or saying about an act of God or various things that happen that is outside-the-box challenges that election officials. I was just thinking about when Sandy happened and what happened in New Jersey. They actually had a very successful election. That was unbelievable, the challenges. And one personal experience, we all remember where we were on 9/11. And many cities were having their election that day, including the city of Detroit. Of course, New York actually was having their election. They canceled their election that day. But in Detroit, I was down at the voting precincts with Chris Thomas. We're talking about Chris Thomas. And we went in the first voting precinct, and they had the TVs on. You watched that plane go into the first tower. And like everybody else, we thought, well, what is that? Was that an accident? What happened, et cetera? And then by the time we got to the second voting precinct, the next plane came into the second tower. And Chris Thomas and I went out and sat in his car, because he was driving me around that morning, and we sat there and looked at each other and said, good Lord, should we cancel the election? Who knew, right? We called the mayor of Detroit. They're closing the Ambassador Bridge. They're closing the Windsor Tunnel. You're wondering about people being out that day or whatever, but I just remember him and I looking at each other thinking, if there's anything that sets us apart from these, I won't use the word, that we thought about it that day, it's our democracy and our ability to vote. And we're going to carry on with the elections. But we weren't really sure if that was the right call or not at that time, but it turned out all right. But some of the things, the challenges that election officials do deal with each and every day, it's an amazing thing. I just have a question. I'm going to pick up on what everybody's talked about, the long lines and everything. And I remember when I first saw this commission being the construct of the commission, I thought, if the president's smart, he'll put somebody from Disney on there, because nobody does lines better than Disney anywhere in the world. And if you did have somebody on there, and I think the commission went down and visited Disney, and you even have a term, the queuing theory, I believe it's called, getting in the queue, in the lines and customer service, et cetera, et cetera. Is there anything that you really found from Disney that you thought could have application to the line situation, the long line situations?
I think our visit informed us that the whole field of industrial engineering, which deals with queuology and lines, really has a lot to offer election officials. And in fact, Chris was among those who told us about this, that there are industrial engineers in city and state government who don't do things around helping the polling places in their jurisdictions with problems, but certainly could. So I think that we were greatly informed by that. There are also just kind of tricks of the trade that we saw, things like informing people of how big the lines are so that you can sort of gauge what the best time to vote is. We did have a revelatory moment in Dumbo's Flying Circus, actually, where You've got a lot of 5- and 6-year-olds who you don't want to put standing in line for 30 minutes. And so rather than that, you can go up when you first get there, get a time that you'll be able to use the ride. And then there's a big playground where you can just sort of set 5- and 6-year-olds loose. To take that to a voting center, that would be the central place where there are chairs. So you would go in, see how long the line is, be told an approximate time to vote, and then be able to vote in comfort, something like a jury room while you're waiting to get called for jury duty. That's the kind of practical solution that...
It's like the Fast Pass or whatever they call it in Disney,
or
right?
Fast Pass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Bauer? Yeah.
Yes, we were really struck by what we saw of Disney's constant reevaluation of how well they're doing. That was very inspiring to the election administrators, that they were continually thinking through what they had done before to make the experience a good one for their customers and how they might still improve upon it. It's just a continuous effort on their part to think through, by close contact with their customers, they survey them regularly and intensively, how they can make this experience work best for them, reduce the lines, and make sure the problems, when they're detected, are addressed. And so, yes, it was an example again of how powerful sound administrative practice can be. We also we did spend a day there. We were a little late leaving because it was difficult to peel Ben Ginsberg away from the souvenir stand. But we've
Let me say that I thought Bob did amongst his best thinking wearing mouse ears.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to get back to a serious question here. This committee has had some hearings about military vote, and you mentioned about the military vote, and I think we all agree that certainly the brave men and women that are our ambassadors for liberty and freedom and democracy need to make sure that they have the ability to vote conveniently, and that their votes arrive in time to be counted accurately, et cetera. We've talked to the Department of Defense through FVAP and other types of things, really trying to understand what they have done to try to expedite and improve all of that kind of a process. What is your commission recommendation on something, again, that we could really help amplify the message to the state and local election officials in regards to military vote?
One of the more positive messages we heard, and I touched on this in my opening statement, is that the Congress's persistent attention to military voting issues over the years, and we had testimony about over a very long period of time, the different statutory enactments that Congress has worked with in trying to improve the military voting experience, has paid off. And there was widespread agreement that the MOVE Act, which significantly improved the delivery of ballots to our military voters in time for them to be able to participate in the election, has worked very well. Having said all of that, the challenges there are really significant, and we can see opportunities for the federal government to continue to look at the effective circulation, for example, of registration information to military voters, to make sure that voters actually have what they need in the way of information about how to participate. There are offices, for example, on bases that are meant, when they onboard military personnel, meant to describe for them the registration opportunities and give them the means to register. And there was some suggestion in the testimony, significant suggestion in the testimony, that these are not being staffed as effectively and not performing as effectively as they might. And so there is certainly room for Congress to continue to attend to what it's done here, kind of the legal framework it's set up for here, because as always, the success of these lies in the details. And I think the details are going to require Congress's continued attention.
On the state and local level, if you're serving in the military overseas or just living overseas, your point of contact with voting is going to be your state or county website, really, from the Secretary of State or the county election official. And there was a great deal of variation in terms of the quality and usefulness and user-friendly nature of those sites. So there are some best practices that we've suggested and examples that we've pointed out of sites that seem really good because members of the military and people living overseas will be able to use them more efficiently if they're up to speed.
Just one final question or perhaps comment, because Mr. Rokita and I actually introduced a bill called the Voter Registration Efficiency Act, but back in Michigan, we really were sort of the genesis of motor voter, because we were one of 3 states in the nation where the Secretary of State, who did the elections, also did the motor vehicle administration. So we had all the databases, and you're much more likely to change your registration or become register to vote initially, or change your voter registration address if you're coming in to do a driver's license change than you are perhaps to go to your local voter registration place and change it. So in Michigan, we always had, I think, always in the 90 percentile of everybody who was registered to vote or eligible to register to vote were registered to vote. But we never did any better than the national average in participation either. So again, for all kinds of reasons, the same kind of reasons every state has, I suppose. But one of the things is we, of course, want to make sure that nobody votes more than once, even in different states. And the thing that really brought this to our attention, there was a lady that was running for Congress, actually from Maryland a couple of years ago, who voted twice in 2 different elections in 2 different states, and subsequently had to, her nomination did not go so well when that came to light. But at any rate, there are a number of states, or a number of people, probably not through negligence, just because we call them snowbirds in Michigan, right? Maybe they're in Florida, or maybe they're in Arizona, or wherever they are, that don't change their voter registration, but then they register to vote in a new state. And we were looking at some examples where there are, there could be hundreds of thousands just in one state of individuals who are registered in more than one place. So anyway, our legislation just said if you go to a state to register, the DMV or the Secretary of State or whatever it is in that particular state would ask you, are you registered to vote in any other state? Just ask that simple question, which we thought could really weed out. But we had a little bit of pushback from AMVA, from the Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, because they said, listen, this registering to vote that's not our job here. And they were concerned about all of that. But I do think that, I'm not sure if your commission, I guess that's my question, did the commission look at anything like that, talking about utilizing databases to be able to weed out duplicate voter registrations? Or do you think that that we're on the right track with thinking about that kind of legislation, or would that be helpful, or did you look at it? Or
We did talk about it. Certainly urging states to tie in the voter registration databases with the motor vehicle databases will make changes of address problems that occur on voter rolls, would reduce it tremendously. And that's something we do talk about and recommend, really led by Chris Thomas, who did talk about the Michigan experience. We also urge states to join 2 programs that exist which do compare their databases. There's the Interstate Voter Cross-Check Program that was started in Kansas, and the ERIC project that was originally funded by Pew. And I think it's now 29 states belong to the Interstate Cross-Check Program, and I believe it's 11 belong to the ERIC program. Those are both complementary interchanges of databases designed to stop precisely that. So it both serves to stop duplication of voter registrations in multiple states and provides a much more accurate list of eligible people who are not registered to vote so that they can be contacted to register.
Yeah, I completely agree with Ben on that. I think the list exchanges that we endorsed as fulfilling a variety of purposes, from preventing the problem that you identified to also identifying voters eligible to vote who could be encouraged to vote and hadn't been.
thank you very much. The ranking member have any other questions?
One real quick statement. We're talking about elections. I want to thank my friend from Florida for educating me. I didn't know what a Chad was. I thought it was a Chad Everett was the only Chad. Now I know there's dimpled Chads, pregnant Chads, hanging Chads, So thank you, and thank you, State, for that.
Any other questions from gentlemen from Florida?
I'll pass.
Gentleman from
Well-
Indiana? Certainly.
That's,
And hopefully you spent a lot of money, because the state of Florida really does appreciate that. Thank you very much.
It all emanates in Florida. I mean, you know. I certainly, I think I speak on behalf of the entire committee. This has been a really interesting hearing. And again, we appreciate both of you taking the time to come in to the hearing today and testify and answer the questions. And certainly for your service, as we all have said, on the commission. It's very good work. And we are looking forward to trying to help amplify the message and the recommendations, et cetera. I know you mentioned, I think you called it the Bipartisan Policy Center that is working with the local election officials. So if there's something that we can do to assist with them, we certainly want to be able to do that, and look forward to your suggestions and input on that. And at this time, without objections, I would mention that all members have 5 legislative days to submit to the chair additional written questions for the witnesses. We would ask the witnesses to respond if they can do so that the answers may be made part of the record. And with that, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thanks. Very good.